You ever start a project, put it aside, and then never come back to it? Yeah, me too. 5 years ago, I worked on a Demon Prince kit bash for my Death Guard army and didn't like how it was turning out, but didn't really know how to make it look any better. So today I'm going to figure out if I've learned anything over the last 5 years and how to take an old unfinished paint job and make it look great in just a few hours. Y'all remember before the new Demon Prince kit came out, we all had to kit bash our own, so we had one that didn't look like ass? Those were the days. Back then, I was pretty excited about the idea of using the Korgorath as a base for my Nurgle Prince, switching out his mess of a face with a goat skull and some horns from the GW Skulls box. Now, it may look like this half-painted model is pretty much done, but when I look at it, I see a lot of room for improvement that shouldn't take much time to do. If there's one thing I've learned in the last 5 years since I originally painted this model, God, I hope it's more than one thing, but let's be realistic, is that it's amazing how boring models can look at the table when you don't really go out of your way to boost their shadows. So for this model, I'm bringing out one of my favorite shadow colors, Dark Plum, because just going with a darker green color for shadows on the green skin is just going to be too flat and boring. If you're not sure what interesting color to use in the shadow, just use the opposite one that's on the color wheel. God damn it, that's not a color wheel. That's a color wheel. Opposites. I just go through and place this color in any downward facing areas. And don't be afraid to paint whole sections like the underside of the legs and buttocks with this deep shadow color. I mean, just check out the clenched cheeks on this guy. You got to get all up in there with your brush. We've got the darks, now let's go to the lights and highlight up this skin. Now again, I'm not using a green for this at all. As long as the majority of that skin is a green color, it will read to our eyes as skin. But I want this to look like flesh, and for that, we need to highlight with flesh tones. This won't make the skin feel less green, but it will bring life to the surface, as it will feel like there is blood coursing in the flesh beneath. One reason why I find it's hard to paint skin is that it's really hard to highlight. There's not those nice crisp edges that make our life easier. What I try to do is find any high point or edge that I can, even if it's not a crisp detail on the model. And I'm going to use the paint to accentuate these lines and dots to create a crispness even when the model doesn't have it. And I'm not really focused in on finding these areas. I'm just scanning over the model and seeing what jumps out at me, because those are the areas I'm going to want to highlight anyway. I'm not going to waste time here trying to make this perfect, because if I do that, I'll probably lose momentum, and then I'll put this thing back on the shelf and I'll never finish painting it. The frame of mind that I'm using for this upgraded paint job is I'm just treating each surface, even if it has highlights or shadows already there, as if it was just base coated, because that's typically what we start with. And most of us as new painters don't push the highlights and shadows far enough away from our midtone as we should to really create a dynamic paint job. But by just pushing those boundaries even farther, I'm actually making a big difference, and it doesn't require me a lot of time to pull this off. There's a number of details on this model that really speak to me, largely the areas of flayed flesh and these skulls that are popping out of its skin like pimples. So next, I want to really accentuate these areas, because right now they're just kind of fading into everything else that I've painted around them. The easy way to fix this is to create a quick outline around all of those with this blood-like dark crimson glossy paint. And this doesn't need to be done cleanly with nice crisp lines, because blood would be seeping and dripping out of these areas anyway. The point of the work we did on the skin with the shadows and the highlights was to create contrast, and this glossy finished paint creates a different kind of contrast. Where most of the paint on our model is a matte or satin finish, this will really stand out as being unique and interesting to our eye because of its gloss. Before this project, I hadn't used this paint before, but I'm glad I picked it up. It really does the blood thing really well. But note that you can make a glossy paint out of any miniature paint you have. Just add a couple of drops of gloss varnish to it, and you can create this interesting glossy look on any surface you want. Next, let's move on to the wings, which appear to only have a black primer and a white zenithal from above, like I had started the entire model with 5 years ago. And these wings are one of those wonderful things in Warhammer where there's a ton of intricate detail on them, but you don't want to spend an hour and a half on each individual wing to make it look good. It's entirely likely that the reason why I stopped painting this figure 5 years ago was because of these wings and their ridiculous amount of detail, and I just didn't want to do it. But that's okay, I've got a trick to work around that. But first I need to determine their color, and I'm gonna go with that same red accent color we've already used on the model, but then I'm gonna darken it down with a blue wash to accentuate all those details on the wings. I don't know about you, but I hate waiting for washes to dry, and I've learned the hard way that taking a blow dryer to them is not the right approach. But we're going to move on to something else while we do wait for that to dry. We've got this weird tentacle hand thing we need to paint, and I want it to feel like it's a part of the whole model, but I want it painted slightly different than the rest of the skin tone. Well, we're off to a poor start here because this purple looks ridiculous next to everything else we've painted. I'm going to try to remedy it by placing 2 different thick paints on the model and wet blending them together. I can desaturate that purple a bit while we add a nice gradation from a purple up to a more skin tone. And I can always go back in with some thin dark blue or black paint to dial back that purple. Remember, painting something with 1, 2, or 3 coats does not need to be your final destination if you don't want it to be. You can boost up the saturation or desaturate anything you want after the fact. I highlight the tentacles with barbarian flesh and eventually add in some of that same highlight color that I use for the rest of the skin, so it really brings in this odd part of the skin to the rest of it. Looking around the model, I realize that the skin isn't the only area that I painted 5 years ago that's falling a little flat. The bone all the way around the model, while respectable, is not quite where it should be. From the looks of it, I must have done a basic base coat, a wash, and then some highlights over all the bone, but I didn't go bright enough. Today's video is brought to us by something I now use every single day: Kamikoto Japanese steel knives. I love to cook for my family, and I've had a nice set of chef's knives for a number of years now, but I can't understate how much better these knives are and how much more fun prep work and cooking is with a great tool like this. Kamikoto makes these Japanese steel kitchen knives using traditional techniques from Japan. They build on a legacy of over 800 years of Japanese technology and expertise in creating the steel that makes knives that have been meticulously handcrafted from using traditional techniques that date back to the Edo period of Japan. Because of their single beveled edge, these knives are so unbelievably sharp. And combine that with a lifetime warranty, it's no wonder why Michelin star chefs around the world use them as their daily drivers. Each blade is crafted only using steel sourced from mills in Japan and using techniques that have been honed and perfected by generations of knifesmiths. Each Kamikoto knife goes through a rigorous 19-step process that takes several years from start to finish to complete. Each knife or set comes in this beautiful ash wood box, which is extremely sturdy and keeps your knives safely stored. It also means they make a great gift because they come included with a sexy gift box. Kamikoto is offering an awesome holiday sale right now, and on top of that, you can use code NINJAN for an extra $50 off at checkout. So go to kamikoto.com/ninjan to get yourself a sexy set of Japanese steel knives, or for someone on your holiday shopping list. And yes, my original paint job on this bone looks just fine, but because it's not going too bright or too dark, it just kind of blends into this blah middle ground. I'm just going around and following where I had already placed some highlights, and I'm punching up the brightest areas with 1 or 2 jumps in highlights. Just a few minutes of hitting surfaces and edges with a thick ivory paint is about all it takes. of the other details I failed to paint at all 5 years ago was the belt around this demon's waist, which is a very important detail because these tiny leather straps are the only things holding up the plate, covering up his demon junk. I want these leather straps painted dark, otherwise they're just going to get lost on the pale skin that's surrounding them. Honestly, one of the biggest factors I use when determining what color to paint some detail of a model is what colors are surrounding it. If whatever I'm trying to paint is next to two dark surfaces, I'm going to paint it a lighter color, and in this case, vice versa. This is also one of those reasons why painting an entire model in like black armor never ends up looking very good. It just ends up being too much dark on dark, and you just can't see the details and definition anymore. When you're painting tiny little army men's, you really want to break up the model with lights and darks alternating, so it's easier to see everything that's going on. All right, the wash on our wings has dried, so let's bust out a dry brush. I start with the same base color we used before we washed them, focusing more of my attention on the tips and upper sections of the wings so we get this nice fade from a dark up to a lighter crimson color. From there, I take a pure crimson color and roughly outline the details of the wings with the side of my brush. These wings have a lot of tiny textures on them, and I don't care if the lines are perfectly straight. The technique I'm using here is often referred to as overbrushing. It's kind of like dry brushing, but with a regular paintbrush. You load your brush up with thick paint and you wipe most of it off on a paper towel. That way, when you just hit the edges of the wings, your paint will be deposited, but it won't run everywhere over all the other details. Listen, these wings are a rush job. You know it, I know it, I'm asleep fine at night knowing it. But when I'm painting a super detailed part of a model, and I know I've got a lot of other models I want to paint, I'm just going to worry about the most defining bits and edges and paint those and keep moving. Oh yeah, I forgot that I've got to color match the edges of these wings to fit the same color as the demon skin, and I have no idea what color green I used for that base coat. No reason to stress over it. I'm just gonna grab a light desaturated green, slap that on as a base coat, and hope for the best. The trick I'll use to hide the color match is I'm gonna make a wash of that same shadow color that I used all over the skin and slap it all over these sections of the wings. And then I'll use that same desaturated green as I used for the base color. I'll highlight up just a little bit with that, and we'll call it good enough. All right, I'm about 3 hours into this paint job, which is where I want to be. I want to finish this in one night just so I can move it out of the unfinished pile. But I do have a few final quick tricks to push the final look. The first being how to boost some darkness and interest into the base. I'll mix up a quick oil wash of Payne's Gray, and I'll get way more depth and darkness out of this really fast. I can just slap it over the areas that I want darker, and I can buff it off with Q-tips. From there, I just touch up some of the tips of the rock with Xandri dust, which was already on my palette from highlighting the leather belt, and the rocks are good. I also want to add a little bit of color interest in the bone on this model since there's quite a bit of it. And I think a mossy, decomposing bone feels very Nurgle, so I'm going to bust out Dirty Down's Moss. I'm going to use this pretty sparingly because this stuff can quickly overtake the look of a model. I can always add more if I think it needs more. And if it's too vibrant in some areas, you can go through with a wet brush and kind of fade it out, or you can wait till it dries and come back in with a dark green wash, and it'll pull it into the rest of the paint job and really look nice really quickly. I also use some Dirty Down rust to add some more punchy matte rust effect. Again here, not too much. It seems like I already did some weathering on the metallics way back when I originally painted this guy, which makes sense. Weathering up metals is something I really like to do, so it makes sense that 5 years ago John spent most of his time just painting the metals. So I want to make sure not to cover up all that work I just did. I just want to add some variation and depth to it. And with that, my unfinished Demon Prince is now finished. Pretty fun and really satisfying experience. I'm glad that I did it. Taking something you painted before and understanding how you can make it better and applying that really shows where you've grown as a painter. Plus, when you can figure it out and execute on it in just one evening, it really feels like, hey, you've come a long ways. So I challenge you to find something in your backlog of either finished or unfinished minis to try this on. Or alternatively, you could just take a model and slap some base coats on it and then follow the steps I did today and see if you can boost it up in just one night's work. A giant thank you for all of you that support me and this channel by subscribing, by using the links down below to buy your minis and your hobby gear, by picking up a Ninjon shirt, and especially to those of you that have joined me on the Ninjon Patreon, where you can see my weekly Wednesday behind the scenes videos and join me on the Discord. And with that, I'm going to see you all here again real soon. Just make sure that sometime between now and then, you find time in your day to slay the gray.